So, how do we get this muscle contraction started? How do we start the calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, get it into the sarcoplasm so that it goes to bind to the troponin to move the tropomyosin and make those active sites available for myosin to bind and then shorten those sarcomeres? How do we get that started? This is where we're going to have to use the nervous system. This is where the nervous system comes into play. The skeletal muscles cannot do this type of contraction or can't do this contraction unless it's stimulated by a nerve. We're going to review those steps of the nervous system being activated and then stimulating that release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And we know if you take away the nerve input through poisoning or just paralysis, then those muscles no longer work. And in fact, over time, when a muscle is not stimulated, it begins to atrophy or become what we call atrophied, which is it'll shrink when it's not used. It's essentially, if you don't use it, you lose it. And we call this denervation atrophy, the shrinkage of the paralyzed muscle when the nerve remains disconnected. So when you continue to not stimulate a muscle, it will atrophy because you're not using it. Skeletal muscles are serviced by somatic motor neurons. In a few chapters, we will talk about the divisions of the nervous system. One division that is solely devoted to skeletal muscles and voluntary movements is the somatic motor neurons. So the division of the somatic nervous system is going to service these voluntary skeletal muscle demands. It's helpful to just start associating somatic with skeletal muscles. These nerve cells have cell bodies that are actually in the brainstem and the spinal cord, but their axons are going to send messages to the skeletal muscles. And those axons are actually called somatic motor fibers. Each somatic motor neuron or each nerve fiber branches out to several muscle fibers. So you're going to end up with one nerve activating several muscle fibers or muscle cells. But each muscle fiber is only going to receive input from one motor neuron. And we can see that here in this schematic. You've got motor unit 2 here that branches out, and it's going to service in this schematic 3 different muscle fibers. But each one of those muscle fibers will only receive input from one motor neuron. This is an important concept to remember. A motor unit is what we refer to as the motor neuron and the muscle fibers that it innervates. And this is how we can see which muscle fibers are innervated by which motor neurons. When we talk about motor units, again, we're talking about one nerve fiber or one motor neuron and all the muscle fibers innervated by it. They will function as one unit. The muscle fibers of this one motor unit are dispersed throughout the muscle. So if you have one motor neuron or one nerve fiber that isn't working, then you've got plenty of others to activate all the other fibers throughout, or all the other muscle cells throughout a muscle. Ideally, you want all of them, but we don't need all. We don't need all of the motor neurons to have a functional contracting muscle. So these muscle fibers are dispersed throughout the muscle. They do contract in unison, and over a wide area, they produce a weak contraction. But if you get more and more motor units involved, more and more nerve fibers activated, then you're going to activate more and more muscle fibers within the muscle. So you can change how strong the contraction is by changing how many nerve fibers are stimulated or activated. And this allows us to have a long-term contraction because these muscle fibers or nerve fibers can take turns, and they're not just using all of their energy at once. To have an effective contraction, you usually need several motor units contracting at one time or stimulated at one time, but you don't ever use all of them at once. Another way to look at these is their division based on size. So these motor units can vary in the size. And small motor units are going to control fewer muscle fibers, but that helps when you're dealing with fine degrees of control. So say using your fingers to write or type. Other examples include your eye muscles. Basically, these motor units are going to only activate 3 to 5 muscle fibers each. The large motor units, on the other hand, are going to provide a lot more strength than they are control. So let's say you want to kick a ball or you want to run fast and far. Those leg muscles need strong contractions, and they don't need necessarily fine control like when you're using your hands to write or to draw. These large motor units are going to have lots and lots of fibers, hundreds of fibers per nerve that it will be activated. Again, legs are an example. Your quadriceps femoris and your calf muscle, the gastrocnemius, can be controlled by motor units that have 1,000 or more fibers attached.